So another major source of water quality issues in Illinois is nitrogen compounds. So where do we get nitrogen compounds? This is a lot from fertilizers. We'll talk more about that. And if you read the books on water quality, this becomes one of the biggest issues, especially nitrates. So NO3 is nitrate, NO2 is nitrite, and ammonia is NH4. And these are the three main types of nitrogen compounds that can be found in the environment. We're going to talk a lot about nitrate because that's the main one that people talk about. We'll talk a little bit about nitrites, but we'll talk about these different compounds and how they affect our water quality, and this is a major water quality issue in Illinois. So where does nitrogen come from? Well, basically it's what's called a non-point source pollution. We can't point to a location and say that's it. That's the point where we got the contamination in there. It's so diffuse because all the farmers of the area are doing it. So if we look at here, this is our glaciated region again. If you remember from the last, there's our unglaciated zone. So we're focusing on this glaciated region, and you look at the color red. This is the amount of nitrogen fertilizer that is in per pounds per square mile. So on a square mile here, this is how much is being placed in here. And if you look at Illinois, Indiana, we're just a giant red blob, you know. And then when we look at it, especially in the central part, which is where we're at here, this green right here represents farm fertilizer. It is the main source of it. We have some manure, a little bit of atmospheric. We'll talk a little bit about that. And the non-farm fertilizer is just a wee bit. Now, if we go to the East Coast, it switches what distribution it is. If we go out towards Iowa, Nebraska, all this stuff, it's the same like we have, and then very far out west, they have a lot more manure that they put out. But our main issue when we talk about nitrates, we talk about nitrogen compounds, is really coming from farm fertilizer. So we live in the land of corn and soybeans, and these compounds get put down on the farm fields all the time. So nitrates, we add them to soil. Not all of it is taken up by the plants. So we add nitrates and phosphates to soil because it helps the plants grow bigger. So we want bigger plants, we want more plants and stuff. And so with the amount of soil and stuff like that, it's not always taken up by plants. So what we have to do is we put on excess amounts of it, and we hope that it goes into there. Now with new things that we're trying to do is like with farming, they want to have it so that they put just the right amount on, but you know, a lot of times farm fields, they're not ready for that, so they just put down what they can. In the nitrates in the spring runoff, we get a lot of it. So what farmers do is in the fall, they apply nitrates to the soils, okay, but their plants aren't growing, so why would they apply nitrates in the fall? I was always perplexed by this because I'm like, wait a second here. Why aren't you just applying it in the spring and there's no plants growing? And so my mom used to do this. So my dad did it, I should say. When my dad was alive, every fall he would fertilize the grass. And my mom started doing it after my dad passed away. And I'm like, why are you doing this? This makes no sense. The grass isn't growing. You're just putting it on here. So I finally talked to some farmers and talked to some people and figured out, well, why is this? Well, the reason that farmers do it is because what happens is this can increase in the spring when they can plant. So the nitrogen is just sitting there. It's not being used by the plants. We really don't have a lot of runoff in the winter, hopefully. If it's frozen and we're getting snow, we don't have a lot of runoff of that nitrogen. So that nitrogen sits inside of the soil. And then what happens is they can plant, and that nitrogen's available right away for the plants. So they don't have to wait 2 or 3 weeks to put the nitrogen compounds on, because you can't put the nitrogen and the plants in at the same time. And so that there's this delay. And so if the weather is correct, you can actually increase the amount of growth you get and get those plants growing. But what happens when you have an extremely wet spring, lots and lots of runoff? Well, what ends up happening is you get lots of the nitrogen compounds flushing into the rivers and streams. It moves downstream. It doesn't work in some years. So some years, like 2019, where it was so wet, all that nitrogen they put down just moved downstream. So we get the spring runoff where we get all this water, and all of that nitrogen that was applied in the winter is now coming off of it. So, and then back to my mom, I figured this out and I told her all of this. And so she stopped doing it. She stopped having them fertilize in the thing. Cause I'm like, you're fertilizing grass, Mom. You know, who really cares if the grass can start growing a little bit? You can apply it later on. She just, oh, your dad always did it. And I'm like, so no. So at least I got her to change that. So maybe if you can get your families to change it too. It's just, so urban areas also do, just kind of talking about my mom again. Urban areas also are hotspots for nitrogen compounds because people have those things like ChemLawn. They want to have their green lawns, their perfect lawns. I mean, there's some places in the United States where you live in a HOA, homeowners association, and you have to have your grass a certain color green, and you have to maintain it. Ridiculous. Grass is just a useless plant. But, you know, grass needs to be certain green, so they'll force you to water, they'll force you to fertilize, or people just want to have these perfect lawns. It's their thing, and so they put down a lot of fertilizers, nitrates, and so this all runs off because they're not putting it down right. They just kind of sprinkle it everywhere, and they're not accurately doing it. So, and then when we do this, it increases the algae. So when we put in, so algae is a plant. It's you know, a singular cellular plant. It likes the nitrogen compounds into there. It uses photosynthesis and it grows. So when we have all of this algae, this nitrate going into the waterways, we get this increasing of algae. Well, when we get increasing of algae, what that does is it's what's called eutrophication. I don't remember if I put that slide in here or not. Nope. Didn't talk about eutrophication, so I'm going to talk about it here. Hey! But it relates to a lot of the stuff we've already been talking about when we talked about oil. Remember we talked about oil and how oil is formed? Talked about coal, anaerobic conditions. This is the same thing here. We're just speeding that process up. So we make anaerobic conditions because the algae are using up all the oxygen. It uses up all the oxygen. We get these anaerobic situations, or what we call anoxic. So oxic means that there's a lot of oxygen. Anoxic means that there's no oxygen. Remember oil and gas, oil forms, coal forms under these anaerobic conditions. So everything keeps coming back to you. Okay, so nitrogen concentrations vary in redox conditions. So what this is right here is this is the median nitrate concentration in groundwater, okay, in milligrams per liter. So if we have this upper part here, this is in urban environments, this is agricultural environments. So if we're in urban environments, you know, within the city, under oxic conditions, we have lots of nitrate. Under anoxic conditions, we have very little. And the same thing in agricultural systems. We have lots in our, and very little in here. When we look at your nitrogen input within 500 radius of a well, there's very little of it coming in. Most of it is coming from atmospheric or non-farm fertilizers, the urban, the story of my mom. But for out agricultural areas, almost all of it's coming in from farm fertilizer. So if we have aerobic systems, we're going to get a lot more of it. So this decreases under anaerobic conditions. So keep that in mind. Some of the reasons we want to remove nitrogens from our system is because of toxicity. So ammonia toxicity, there is both ammonia and ammonium. It's toxic to fish. So as this builds up, this is why when your fish, you know, like you go goldfish and you got to clean out the tank and stuff, you'll get a buildup of this ammonia and it'll kill your fish. Goldfish are generally like carp and they can survive almost anything. That's why they survive so long and stuff like that at homes. Their blood tissues will cause their changes in their blood pH. They'll cause enzymatic changes, and they'll reduce their membrane stability, and they'll increase their oxygen consumption to the gills, and it'll reduce their oxygen transport within their bodies. So basically what you're doing is you're damaging the cells by putting so much ammonia, and you're changing that they can't breathe. So yeah, you got to clean that out. One of the other things that causes with nitrates and nitrites in the environment is the big problems with nitrates in the environment is blue baby syndrome. So you can see a little picture here. So blue baby syndrome is what happens especially with infants under the age of 6 months old. Babies under the age of 6 months old have a different form of hemoglobin in their body. So they cannot carry the oxygen the same way we do. So if they get nitrates inside of there, and their stomach bacteria are different too. They're basically, when infants are born, they're born actually premature, because in order to be able for us to walk upright, to have the smaller hips, you had to have a smaller birth canal. Therefore, we were kind of born like not fully ready. And so for the first 6 months, our hemoglobin is different, our bacteria gut is different. We're still getting ourselves kind of together. And so if you get exposed to nitrates at that time, what will happen is those will turn to, they'll reduce inside of the stomach and produce nitrites. Well, this nitrite combines with the hemoglobin to form this methyloglobin, which can't carry oxygen. So basically, you're converting the iron in the blood from ferrous iron, F2, to ferric iron, F3. And F3 cannot bind oxygen. So you're breathing, but you're not actually taking in any oxygen. And so the blood turns from red to brown and you become anemic. And that's what's happening with these babies. So this is really critical that children under the age of 6 aren't exposed to nitrate or nitrite. Nitrate, the maximum contaminant level, or MCL, is 10 milligrams per liter. Nitrate is nitrogen. And nitrite is 1 parts per million. So very low concentrations. A lot of it is being put in because of farming actions. So how do we fix this? Well, there's a couple different ways. Well, we can decrease the concentration. Precision farming really is where things are going, where you're having satellite images, you're testing the soil. There's a whole bunch of things going on right now with AI, drones, sensor technology is really taking off, so that a farmer is only putting on exactly what they need at the exact location at the exact right point. And so if we could decrease the concentrations, we can do that. Maybe putting in slow release, so that once you apply it, it slowly comes out throughout the year and helps the plants instead of being readily available. Planting legumes. Okay, so what is a legume? A legume are things like peas. That's a legume. So your peanuts, your peas, your beans, any of those type of things are legumes. Well, what does legumes do? Well, what legumes have is on their root system, they have these nodules all over their roots. And on those root nodules, what happens is it takes nitrogen gas from the atmosphere and converts it into useful forms of nitrogen that can then be used by the plant. So there's bacteria in there that are using the nitrogen gas. Our atmosphere is mostly nitrogen gas. It's 78% nitrogen. They used to have this thing where you fill your tires with full nitrogen. I'm like, well, I'll just stick with my 78%. And the one guy looked at me like, oh, that is a lot. And I'm like, yeah, that's just atmospheric nitrogen. So it takes a lot of the nitrogen gas from the atmosphere and converts it into useful forms. If we didn't have these bacteria that would take the nitrogen gas from there, it would be hard to get the nitrogen from our gas form into a useful form that we all need for all of our biology. I mean, all of us need nitrogen for our biology. And so it's very hard unless we have these bacteria. There is some atmospheric where lightning strikes can cause some of it to occur, but that's so infrequent. So legumes are a great way to do this. You can also put in natural manure, so like natural nitrogen like manure. So manure has a lot of nitrogen compounds into it, especially cow, or even our waste has a lot of nitrogen into it too. And so this will increase the BOD, biological oxygen demand. If we increase BOD, this is a lot of organic material into the system. If you think about oil and gas, put up too much organics, what happens to that whole system? You really need to get this down, because this is a key point to so many parts of this class, is understanding anaerobic conditions, swamp conditions. It affects water quality even to today. Okay. So rural water quality can be very poor in these systems. So one of the things that we get with rural water quality, especially in these isolated glacial aquifers, is you can get reducing conditions. Again, anoxic, without oxygen. You should all understand that. I mean, if you think about the soils around here, the soils are black carbon, right? And so as water's going through them, it's using up all the oxygen. So a lot of our groundwater systems around here are anoxic because of all the organic material in the soil. Okay, these all should be coming back. This should be familiar from before. So under reducing conditions, you'll get that hydrogen sulfide smell, that rotten egg smell, because we have sulfate from the gypsum. If you guys remember all of this, where does the gypsum come from? How does gypsum form? Where is that all coming from geologically? Okay, that is being created into hydrogen sulfide. You can also get a lot of iron forming. So iron under anaerobic conditions moves through the soil. As soon as it hits oxygen, bam, it turns into rust. And so what happens is that's why we get rust stains in a lot of our systems, is that under anaerobic conditions, the iron is just moving fine. Under aerobic conditions, it slows it down. And then you can also get methane gases forming. I think when we talked about fracking, some of these people with their homes, and they're like, oh, my gases, some of them may have already had methane gas. If they had a lot of anaerobic conditions in their system, you can actually get methane coming into there in that system. So other things that will happen is we can get herbicides and pesticides into our water. So herbicides go against plants, pesticides go against insects. They're very widespread. They're hard to confine. So if we look at agricultural versus urban settings, we see in streams lots and lots of pesticides and herbicides in streams in urban settings. Again, I don't want dandelions in my yard, so I'm going to put tons of Actually, dandelions are very beneficial. They're root systems. They create a lot of phosphorus. They put a lot of nutrients back into your system. You can also make dandelion wine. There's a whole bunch of great things. Do not pollute. Dandelions are wonderful. So our groundwater and stuff like that actually is very polluted with herbicides and pesticides in urban settings because people want these perfect lawns. The companies want these perfect lawns, and so they're putting those down. 2,4-D, which was Agent Orange. So if you know what Agent Orange was, that was during Vietnam. That was a defoliant that we used in Vietnam. We would spray it over the jungles so that we could see the guerrilla warfare, and we also sprayed it on all the food crops of the northern Viet Cong in order to be able to starve them out so that they would have to come to the south where we had food. So 2,4-D, or Agent Orange, we still use it today. It's in, like, if you get Camelon coming out and they spray your yard, they're spraying 2,4-D. They're spraying Agent Orange on your grass. Okay, so just so you know. So we have a lot of that. It's not just an agricultural problem, it's an urban problem too. And a lot of these are carcinogen, they're toxic, they make water unpalatable, so you can taste it in there. And so this could be a major problem of it. And then we could also talk about bees, just so you know. Melissa, my name, Melissa. It means bee in Greek, so Melissa. So I'm Polish and Greek, and when I was born, my family's like, Melissa, what a stupid name for a baby. Bee? Bumblebee? So I'm very into bumblebees. So yeah, we need to say, especially bumblebees. I mean, they're kind of like me. Yeah, they're kind of fluffy, and they move around from everything, and they pollinate different flowers and stuff, and yeah, so love the bumblebees. Yeah, all those little girls are just amazing. Sorry, I get off on my little distractions. Even here, when I'm not even just talking to my computer screen, I still get off on my little stories. So I hope you guys appreciate this and laugh or giggle or something. I already talked about 2,4-D, Agent Orange. Here it is. It's 2,4-dichlorophenol acetic acid. And so that was the Agent Orange that we're still using today and helping to do that. Atrazine, if I showed you a map of atrazine for the Midwest, this is just like a hot spot for it. Major, and it's found a lot in our rural water supplies and stuff. Agent Orange, I could go into a whole thing about Agent Orange. There's also, part of the problem with Agent Orange and what really caused major problems was that when Dow Chemical made Agent Orange, they didn't do a complete organic process into it, and so they ended up creating a byproduct called 2,4,5-T. And 2,4,5-T is a dioxin, and it's extremely toxic, and it's what caused all the birth defects, and it was one of the most toxic parts of it. And it was causing the adverse health effects associated with Agent Orange. So Dow Chemical didn't realize that they weren't manufacturing it all right, and this was a contaminant that came inside of the Agent Orange. It was still a good defoliant, but it was also extremely toxic, down to the parts per quadrillion. I mean, really, really toxic stuff. So dioxins, very, very toxic. And so this was part of the problem, was Dow Chemical not doing it. So I also lived in Midland, Michigan, where Dow Chemical was from, and the Tippecanoe River that was through there used to have dioxins in the river bottom, and people would find barrels of this. Oh, side note, why was it called Agent Orange? The sticker was orange. There was also Agent Blue and Agent Green. Agent Orange was because the sticker on the jugs was orange. So that's how the name came about. And it was called Operation Ranch Hand, if you are into your Vietnam history here. I'm really into mid-20th century history, so it's just funny. Okay, so we could go more into Agent Orange if we wanted to talk about it. One of the projects I'd like to do sometime in the future is work in Cambodia and Laos. Even though we weren't at war with Cambodia and Laos, we bombed them like crazy, and we distributed these chemicals on the ground over there. And there's been research that's been done in Vietnam on 2,4-D and the effects of this and birth defects, but we really haven't done anything in Laos and Vietnam. And Laos really wants to do it because they'd like to point the fingers at the Americans for what we did. They weren't even at war with us. We just bombed them anyways. And we could go into the long history. If you're really interested in this stuff, there are classes at NIU that go into this. But one of the reasons we were doing it was because they were going across the borders and hiding. We were really close, especially in Cambodia, getting some of the leaders into there, but they were into Cambodia, and we weren't supposed to be at war with Cambodia. Same thing with Laos. There's just bombs all along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Okay, so today we have much better pesticides. Some of them should be banned, like some of the nicotine ones that are nickel-based, not nickel-based, but they are related to nicotine. Those they really are suspecting are killing off all my little melisas. So they biodegrade relatively fast nowadays. They're less toxic. A lot of them are made from fossil fuels. So this is another use for fossil fuels in there. And so you can create about 500 million tons of those. And how do we fix it? Well, we can put sterile insects out. So when they breed, they produce sterile children. So that's one way. We could trap insects. One of the things that we do around here is why we have corn and soybeans is the pests that grow for corn and the pests that work on soybeans, because soybean is a legume. So they're putting nitrogen into the soil so we can put less nitrogen down. And then the pests that go after this and the pests that go after corn are two different things. And so if you're going back and forth, you never get a buildup on your farm field of those pests. There's some ideas of crops. We could go into, not so much in this class, but we could go into like Glycosafe Safe, Roundup Ready corn, and all the issues associated with that. Those are all just fascinating things that are associated with farming. And part of the idea is that if we make a plant that is resistant by putting in insecticides right into the plant, then we don't have to put as much onto the ground. So it doesn't get it washed away and all this other stuff, but now we're genetically engineering plants. So to solve one problem, we're creating other problems maybe potentially, and so it's always a balancing game. So there's no one right answer to fixing all these things. It's got to be a combination. It's got to be a mixed reagent, mixed ideas. We really need to be fixing these problems, but we have to be looking at it from multiple different angles.